Welcome to the Sidewalk Weekly podcast, a show for people who are big on cities but short on time. I'm Vanessa Quirk. Eric, I have heard that you are finally getting out of New York City for the first time since the pandemic started.
It is true. I'm not just going to our living room, but the reason is I heard you were coming back into town, and I don't think this town's big enough for the both of us.
It's true. I'm going to be rolling up in on Saturday, and you know what? I don't know if the city can handle both Sidewalk Weekly hosts in the same geographic location.
So I will roll out at the same time, but I do have a question for you, which is we'll be renting a car to leave the city since we don't own the car. How many disinfectant wipes would you say is enough to de-COVID a rental?
So when we rented our car, I definitely went in with the wipes on hands maneuver, opening handles with wipes and cleaning every surface around and everything. And then we started driving and I went to move the car seat and I found 7 empty water bottles underneath the seat. And I don't know, just the vision of those dirty used water bottles in the seat made me realize that I had not done enough.
So the answer is the whole bucket of wipes.
Oh, yeah. I'd say so. For you, Eric, for your mental stability, yes.
Maybe I'll bring 2. All right, city lovers, welcome to the Sidewalk Weekly. I'm Eric Jaffe. We'll spend the next 20 minutes or so discussing the biggest stories from the urban tech world, and we'll chat with Laura O'Reilly about how pop-up shops could help ground floor retail recover in cities. When time's up on a segment, you'll hear our little bicycle bell. This week, our top stories look at the ongoing battle against natural gas, the keys to Singapore's housing success, and why boomerang kids shouldn't feel bad about moving back in with their parents.
All right, well, let's get into story number 1.
All right, our first story comes from the New York Times and Ivan Penn, who's writing that some local power utilities are embracing renewable energy sources, but others aren't quite ready to do that, and they're still relying on natural gas. So, Vanessa, why is this debate so important?
Yeah, I mean, it is really important. I think it's also not necessarily intuitive for people to understand. So I think this is a great one to unpack. So what's happening is right now, a lot of energy utilities are starting to turn to renewable energy sources like water and wind and solar. I mean, up to the point that right now, 20% of America's electricity is being generated by renewables. And that's great. That's great for the environment. That's great for us, right? But there's many utilities are saying that they need to keep using natural gas because the sources of wind and solar are too unreliable. Like if a cloud passes and you have cloudy days, you're not going to get your solar power. If it's not windy, you're not going to get your wind power. And they're saying, too unreliable. We need to stick to natural gas. And also their other point is that, batteries, which would make renewables more reliable, that would allow you to store the energy that you're generating, are just currently too expensive for them, right? And so currently where we are in the US is that natural gas accounts for about 40% of our power.
And just to clarify here, natural gas is a worse option from an environmental perspective because even though it's cleaner than something like coal that we used to rely on a lot, it is still a fossil fuel that worsens climate change, and it is not as clean, of course, as renewable energy.
That's exactly right. Natural gas is kind of in between coal and renewables. But the reason that they rely on it and haven't gone whole hog into renewables yet is because of this reliability question. And to understand why they need that reliability, you kind of have to understand this idea of peak demand, right? At moments of high or peak electricity demand, the utility needs to be able to serve a lot of customers at the same exact time. So think about this at midday in August and everyone has their AC units running, right? Everybody wants their power right away and you can't let your customers down.
Right. Yeah, there was one utility executive quoted in the Times piece that said, "We're absolutely committed to investments in renewable energy, but we're also committed to keeping the lights on for customers."
Right. That's exactly right. And so
and the AC's on.
keep the lights on, keep the AC on, right? So the way that utilities and cities have gotten around this is with peaker plants, right? So these are plants that are normally don't operate, but at these moments of peak demand, they kind of pop on. And oftentimes these peaker plants rely on fossil fuels, unfortunately. And there was a great story about this week in Gothamist by Clarissa Diaz. And not only do they run on fossil fuels, but, Diaz points out they're often located in lower income areas and have major negative impact on air quality and local health. So peaker plants are a problem. The reliance on natural gas is a problem. So where we are today is that utilities keep making investments in this kind of infrastructure, this natural gas infrastructure. And what that means is that we're going to be reliant on it for 10, 20 plus years. And what,
these are big investments.
Exactly. And what advocates and environmentalists are saying, and cities are increasingly saying, is that, actually what you need to be doing is investing today in the renewable energy infrastructure so that we're prepared for a greener future.
Yeah. And I think another thing that's important to point out is, we've seen more and more cities start to ban natural gas in buildings, and they're moving to kind of all electric buildings. I think we just saw San Francisco start to make this move. A number of other California cities have done so. It's a really important move. But the thing is, if the underlying power grid itself still runs on natural gas, then it doesn't really matter much if your stove is all electric, because it's still getting its electricity from a grid that relies on fossil fuels. So you have to separate out those two things. We need both the electricity grid and our appliances and buildings to run on clean energy in order to make the right progress.
That's exactly right. And our team at Sidewalk has been thinking a lot about this, not only in how to, have a greener grid, but to have affordable energy that goes along with that. And so we talk a lot about it in our affordable electrification episode for City of the Future.
Right.
And the general idea, just in a nutshell, is to create a system that is better able to store clean energy and deploy it during periods of high demand at a rate that will be, more affordable to people. Another potential answer to this idea of like affordable electricity is community solar. There's been a lot of projects popping up around cities around the world exploring kind of how community solar could create benefits, especially for lower income communities. That Gothamist article kind of ends on that vision. And the idea there is that, during those moments of peak demand, you could provide your own home with the solar power instead of having it come from a peaker plant. So even though the model is kind of new and emerging and there's a lot of challenges still surrounding it, it has a lot of promise, I think, too.
Right. And we're out of time, I know, but that is the key, as you're pointing out, is to keep clean energy affordable, because otherwise we're just creating a different set of problems around affordability in cities, even if we help sustainability.
Correct. Absolutely. Our next story comes from City Lab. It's written by Adam Majendi, and he's writing about why Singapore has one of the highest home ownership rates in the world. It has over 80% of its population living in government-built units. Eric, how did they manage to get this done?
This is a fascinating story. I didn't really know about this, so I enjoyed reading and learning about it. To me, it really strikes me as a story of policy innovation and political will more than anything else, but we'll get to that in a second. So getting back into the history, in 1959, hundreds of thousands of immigrants were moving into Singapore, and housing construction just wasn't keeping pace, both private housing and government housing. The result was a lot of overcrowding, a lot of very poor living conditions. There weren't enough homes for everyone. This is a problem, frankly, that America's coastal cities still face in many ways today. And so Singapore set up what is called the Housing Development Board, and its job is to supply and build affordable homes. So these homes are, they're nothing fancy really, but they're clean, they're safe, they're well maintained. And by the middle of the 60s, this HDB, the Housing Development Board, had housed 400,000 people. But here's the critical thing that it did next. Singapore started a plan called Home Ownership for the People, and it sold apartments to middle and lower income households. These were affordable homes. They had long 99-year leases, and the buyers were forbidden from reselling the property for at least 5 years.
And by forbidding them, I'm assuming the idea here is that, you can't flip the property. Rather, the idea is, you want to build a home, build a community, create economic opportunity for people.
I think that's right. This wasn't in the story, but I think that's right, because there was another aspect to this, which is these homes were built very intentionally in neighborhoods with great access to essential daily goods, very walkable, very transit friendly. Singapore also took steps to ensure racial integration, very firm steps and forceful steps, actually. They required minimal occupancy levels of various ethnic groups to ensure integration. And they maintained the buildings very well, right? You can put up public housing and then just leave it to decay. We've seen too much of that in New York, frankly. But they made sure to upgrade the elevators, the walkways, the common spaces. These are all things people care about and they need to see.
Yeah, that point really stuck out to me. I feel like such a contrast to the way public housing has been maintained in the U.S., right? Like they really considered maintenance an important part of their mandate, not just the construction.
Right, and I think that you could probably argue that played a real big role in the program's success. So just to kind of recap here, the total figures in 2016, the resale value of these HDB apartments was something like 400 billion Singaporean dollars, at least. I don't know what that translates to, but I assume it's quite a large amount, even in US dollars. And Singapore now has more than 1 million of these housing units. And last year, they were still building them, right? They have a continual flow of this to meet demand. There were 70,000 units still in construction even last year. That's astonishing. I can't even think of a US city that builds that many units a year.
So I just looked it up. The 400 Singaporean dollars is $287.50. So that is units that cost about $300 billion overall. So that is pretty incredible. Another thing that's interesting about this is that in the US, public housing tends to have a stigma around it, right? It's seen as being owned exclusively for low-income people. And Singapore found a way to not just eliminate the stigma, but to give residents, a stake in the future of their city, which is such an important role for housing to play. And you can only imagine what it would be like if we did that in the U.S.
And I think that point is a very good one. And having this stake is exactly right, because this becomes household wealth for Singaporeans for generations.
Right.
It will get redistributed across the city, poured back into businesses, poured back into people who are willing to take an opportunity to start a business because they don't have to worry about their safety net as much. And also kind of has this cascading virtuous cycle effect of people won't oppose new housing development as much if they grew up in the same housing development. So I think there's all kinds of social benefits here, and Singapore is really onto something. All right, we're going to stick with stigma, I guess, for our final top story of the week, which comes from The Atlantic and Joe Pinsker, who writes that moving back in with your parents is often seen as a mark of irresponsibility, at least in the U.S., but what the pandemic is showing is that maybe it shouldn't be. Vanessa, what do you think? You ready to move back home?
Well, I kind of did for a couple months there. I was with my boyfriend's parents in their home, but I should emphasize here, of course, that I had the privilege of opting to move and now return home. And I think what Pinsker's talking about here is a number of American adults who've returned to living at home with their parents who probably didn't have that option, right?
Didn't have a choice.
Exactly. Yeah. He talks about a new analysis from Zillow, which indicates that about 2.9 million adults have moved in with a parent or grandparent in the months of March, April, and May. And most of them were 25 years or younger. Some were college students, and some just found rent really hard to cover for these months. And Joe Pinsker is calling these folks boomerang kids. That's the phrase that he kind of coined here.
Right. Boomerang because they left home and now they're back. I don't know if he coined that, but certainly it was new to me.
He uses it. That's right. And it is important to note that, and what I found interesting was that this boomerang phenomenon isn't just about the pandemic, right? So in 2014, living with one's parents was actually the most common living arrangement for Americans aged 18 to 34, right? So that's pretty remarkable. And Pinsker does point out, the Great Recession definitely played a huge role. The labor market was really bleak. There was a lot of student debt, and that kind of started a lot of the movement back home. But he also says that you can't only point to the Great Recession because there's a lot of other trends happening kind of around that are also leading towards this. So, for example, the knowledge economy, making it harder for folks to find a job straight out of high school or even undergrad. The fact that people are marrying a lot later and people are having kids a lot later in life. So all of these are kinds of different reasons why a lot of younger adults might be returning home.
No one reason in isolation. So let's get to this idea that these folks are what Pinsker calls unjustifiably stigmatized. Because it definitely seems like many of them are struggling with stigma. I mean, he talks to a lot of young folks who move back home, and one said, quote, "I never imagined living at home as a 25-year-old. Just that sentence feels like a failure."
Right.
And I think that sentiment is reflected in a lot of the folks he talked with and probably felt by a lot of those who have to make this move. And the media, I think, contributes to this kind of narrative of shame. There was a headline in Forbes that Joe Pinsker noted that said, "Is Gen Y's live-at-home lifestyle killing the housing market?" And I think that's, that completely misses the point here. I think in a really important way, which is that it's not that they're killing the housing market. They can't afford to participate in the housing market. Right. That is the point. And the better question is, how many young people might move into their own place if let's say there were affordable housing programs like the type we talked about last segment with Singapore available to folks who were younger, who were just starting out, who were middle or lower income. If they could have a home, if they could start building household wealth, I think they would do it.
Right. I think that idea of not having the choice and that not being reflected in the media is definitely spot on.
Yeah.
But to play devil's advocate a little bit, I think there are people who increasingly are choosing to live at home as an active choice, kind of flying in the face of that stigma, which I think is really interesting. I mean, I myself kind of faced that stigma when I moved back from home after the Great Recession back in the day. And when I moved to Chile afterwards, and I saw how many people in their 20s and even 30s were still living with their parents, and there was no stigma around it. It was a really kind of enlightening experience for me. And I think a lot of these boomerang kids are also kind of having this experience where they're not alone. A lot of people are doing it. They see people in other countries doing it. And they also start to see the benefits, right? There are benefits with living with your family. You bring the generations closer together. Multi-generational living can not just be more affordable, it can also be a really efficient use of housing stock. It can build social cohesion, right? And Pinsker does note that, there are some challenges sometimes in between generations, especially around things like religion and gender identity and politics. But he says on the whole, there seem to be a lot of social benefits, actually.
Right. And so there's not necessarily kind of a problem to fix
Right.
here. I know we try to talk about solutions at the end of these segments, but I do think, that this trend in general speaks to the need for flexibility in housing units.
Right.
I think that is something we've explored. If you had flexible walls that could quickly create new rooms, or even if you had whole buildings that were designed in a way for common spaces to be rentable for short periods of time, these types of things could reflect the trends of boomerang kids and moving back home. And they might even make the home feel less kind of permanent or final to reduce some of that stigma. So I think those are things that could help in general, and certainly with respect to boomerang kids, but also policies that make smaller homes, accessible dwelling units, permissible and backyard cottages. These types of things right now are very hard to build in cities, and they shouldn't be.
Absolutely. Well, that is it for the top stories this week. As always, you can find the links to these stories in the podcast episode notes. In our next segment, we are going to talk with Laura O'Reilly, who recently worked with Sidewalk Labs to create a pop-up toolkit for landlords and tenants. Back in a sec. We are now joined by Laura O'Reilly. She is the founder of the placemaking platform Wallplay, which has done some really incredible work helping to activate storefronts via pop-ups. Laura, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Laura, thanks for joining us. For our listeners who might not be familiar with Wallplay, could you tell us maybe why you started the organization and what kind of work you do?
Certainly. I started Wallplay because I saw there was a need to help innovate the real estate industry creatively, and space that wasn't being utilized could be brought to life by artists and startups and e-commerce brands. When the company was founded in 2013, we hosted some of the first direct-to-consumer e-commerce pop-ups and their experimentation into brick and mortar. It was really started with the intention to have a more fluid leasing model for people to be able to experiment and see what it was like to host and produce their own store.
You mentioned that, Wallplay is really about helping folks experiment and try out like more fluid leasing models. Could you kind of compare that to how urban retail is typically done? And how does your model kind of attempt to correct some of the challenges in that existing model?
Sure. So Wallplay programs and operates vacant retail spaces until landlords secure long-term tenants. And the way that our model works is that we get the exclusive license to sub-license the space for short-term use. Now, traditional retail currently exists in what is, the long-term lease model. And in order to get a long-term lease, you usually have to have incredible credit, a very large security deposit down, proof of assets, and a very large capital investment at the front, and being able to prove that you have what's needed to execute. So the barrier to entry to obtain a long-term lease is very high. And so I think the most radical thing about the pop-up model is that by allowing, whether it's smaller brands, emerging brands, or existing brands alike, the ability to try out a space before they take a long-term lease somewhere, and vice versa, before the landlord gives a long-term lease to a tenant. From a placemaking perspective, the pop-up model allows both sides to test before they commit.
Laura, can you unpack a bit more the model and how it benefits landlords in particular? Because I think it's intuitive of why a startup or a small business might want a shorter lease or might need more flexibility. But I'm not sure some listeners might understand why it would help a landlord as well to do that, given that they were the ones who really benefited from the older model. So can you talk a bit more about that?
Absolutely. I'll reference an example we have on Canal Street. So Wallplay created a district on Canal Street between Broadway and West Broadway where we populated 22 previously vacant storefronts with pop-ups. And we've been doing this for about 2 years now. And we had a pop-up tenant that wanted a long-term lease, but the landlord wanted to wait for more of a traditional retailer. And so they were able to get to decide what they want on their block and hold out for it if they would like it, while still being able to generate exposure, buzz, and attract the type of tenants that they want. And so if your space is vacant, you also end up in a disadvantaged position where you can get kind of haggled on price as well. And so if the space already has desirability and there's activity, you're in a better position when you're negotiating as well.
We recently produced a blog post here at Sidewalk, and we referenced that project that you guys worked on, which seemed really, really successful for both the folks that were renting the space and activating them, and as well as the landlords that were renting them out. Now, do you have to think about retail differently in the wake of the pandemic?
I think things were already going in the direction that brands do not necessarily want this lingering overhead that these long-term leases create for them. And I think that what we're seeing is going to be a turbo kind of boost towards the direction of really reimagining what the relationship between the landlord and the tenant looks like. And the toolkit that we co-developed with Sidewalk Labs that we released was us open sourcing a lot of our learnings so that landlords and brands alike beyond the spaces we directly operate could take advantage of some of these learnings. And I think the reality is that there needs to be a win-win dynamic in order for everything not to go just completely dark right now. And so the pop-up model, I think, is an interesting way to bridge between the old and the new.
All right, Laura, last one, and we'll let you go here. You mentioned the toolkit that Wallplay has put together and that we wrote about a bit on the Sidewalk blog this week. Can you maybe summarize or give one example to listeners of the type of advice you share in that toolkit?
So I think one of the main takeaways of the entire toolkit is that when you invest in building community infrastructure, your property value will increase. And, that's basically the hypothesis. And by thinking outside of the box, by being willing to take risks, and by allowing spaces to be utilized creatively in new ways, you're not only going to win, but you can get through this. And you have to be willing to try new things.
Well, thank you so much. I really encourage people to check out that toolkit and learn more about Wallplay and On Canal. Thank you so much, Laura.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It is time for our final segment, The Last Smile. This is the segment where we set aside the depressing news of the week and focus on something happy for a minute each. Eric, what had you smiling this week?
All right, so just in time for summer here, or at least for the summer heat, my alma mater, Smithsonian Magazine, has a great but brief history of the ice cream truck. So this is a story by Colin Dickey. It's about an inventor named Harry Burt Sr., who in the 1920s actually first patented the idea of ice cream on a stick. Believe it or not, that is something you could patent. But his more important move was switching from push carts, which is how folks used to sell ice cream around the streets of cities, to the trucks that we kind of know today, so that he could serve people that ice cream on a stick. And so this is actually a pretty lucrative endeavor. Even in the height of the Great Depression, 1932, you could make what today would be $1,800 a week selling ice cream on a stick. through these trucks. It became a mainstay in cities. You know the Mr. Softy music well. If you live in New York, I could drone on long enough here and you'll probably hear it out my window. But anyway,
right?
There you go. Who needs an audio clip when you've got Vanessa?
Exactly.
And who needs regular ice cream when you can have it on a stick? So that's my happy moment. What was yours, Vanessa?
I will defend ice cream in a bowl, though. I mean, there's nothing better. But okay, but on to my choice. So it is a little less cities related than yours, but it not only made me smile this week, it made me really laugh out loud. So I figured I would share the joy with our listeners. So this is a story by Helen Sullivan at The Guardian. She's writing about 19-year-old journalism student Elsa Majimbo, and she's become the Instagram star of Kenya's COVID lockdown. And I think what's really great about Elsa Majimbo is just the glee that she has in kind of pushing back against all the narratives of what you expect from a COVID lockdown, right? And so she says, for example, she'll say like, ever since Corona started, we've all been in isolation. And I miss no one. And then she laughs with abandon. It's just so great.
Why am I missing you? There is no reason for me to miss you. Hakuna. And people keep on telling me you haven't participated in Corona challenges, you haven't joined House Party, you haven't joined TikTok. It's not by mistake. It's not. It's not.
She's also really known for just like eating potato chips while she's talking. And there was one video where she was really clapping back at all the people commenting on her food habits. She's so great. I just wish I had that self-confidence, basically.
I have a new idea.
Oh, a new idea. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah. Potato crisps on a stick.
Attached to the stick
Just,
with what?
Know, they laughed at Harry Bird Jr. Senior too.
Okay,
So,
you better get your patent in,
now.
Eric. Get your patent in now, and the fortune will be coming your way, I'm sure.
All right, go get those crisps, folks, because time is up. Thank you for joining us this week.
If you want to read the stories we discussed today and many more, then you should sign up for the Sidewalk Weekly newsletter at sidewalklabs.com.
We should note that the views expressed in the Sidewalk Weekly don't necessarily reflect Sidewalk's company position.
And if you think that we're missing a perspective or want us to talk about something, let us know. Send an email or voice memo to podcast@sidewalklabs.com. And we might just talk about it in a future episode.
The Sidewalk Weekly is produced by Vanessa and me. This week's episode was edited by Andrew Calloway. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions, and our art is by the great Tim Cow. See you next time.
Goodbye.